Morning, everyone, for those watching real time or watching it later in the morning. This is another one of our in-house in focus sessions. Today we are covering dark patterns. So the subject line is Dark Patterns Decoded, Legal Risks in Digital Design in Websites, E-commerce and Apps. And Katrina and Sam are going to be presenting most of it, with me chipping in a bit at the start and the end. I'm not going to say an awful lot at the start, other than to comment that this is an area that we are seeing people increasingly take an interest in, and that it cuts across a number of different practice areas, hence Katrina and Sam covering, as you'll see, a number of different areas of law during the course of the presentation, but also affects, well, I was going to say lots of different sectors in terms of the clients that we work with, but I mean, it's probably fair to say, given that it relates to websites, it affects all sectors, because I think everyone has a website pretty much these days. So that's all I was going to say on the introduction. On that note, hand over for the overview.
Hi, everyone.
Sorry, Sam.
No worries. Hi, everyone. So yeah, just a quick overview to start off with. So we'll look at dark patterns and the online choice architecture within which they sit. Plus, we'll give you some context around dark patterns and why they're increasingly important. Then we'll look at the legal framework for dark patterns and how you differentiate between the neutral online choice architecture and dark patterns. And we'll also give you a bit more information on the new Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act, because it's a relatively new piece of legislation. We'll then cover some examples of dark patterns, and finally, we'll look at enforcement, including some case studies and trends. So firstly, what are dark patterns, and what is the wider online choice architecture within which dark patterns sit? The online choice architecture is a term that you'll hear used by regulators and also frequently alongside the term dark patterns. Broadly, it's just the design of the online environment. It's neither inherently good nor bad. The CMA has given some examples of what constitutes the online choice environment. This includes things like the order of products in search results, the number of steps needed to cancel a subscription, whether an option is selected by default. Dark patterns, on the other hand, are basically just a subset, a sort of a negative element of the online choice architecture. There's no fixed definition of what a dark pattern is, and importantly for our purposes, and for your purposes, there's no legislative definition. There's no sort of overarching legislative definition of a dark pattern. Two potential ways in which they could be described. One is techniques which seek to deceive, coerce or manipulate consumers into making decisions which are no longer free or informed. Or they can be described as a user interface that influences consumer choices in a bad way. In effect, they cover any method that a site uses to try and get a consumer to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. Three key points probably to mention at this stage. One, dark patterns are primarily an issue which arise in the digital sphere. Two, as you can see, it's a very wide definition, so it potentially covers a whole host of different scenarios. And three, the law won't always prohibit a technique which meets the definitions above, but many will fall foul of the various underlying legal prohibitions. For the purpose of this presentation, we'll be talking about dark patterns in the context of unlawful dark patterns, and giving you context on why and how to identify when a dark pattern is unlawful. Useful point just to make at this juncture as well is that the EU has actually got, or is getting closer to kind of having an overarching definition of prohibition on dark patterns. They have the Digital Services Act, which prevents dark or online platforms from designing, organizing, or operating their online interfaces in a way which deceives or manipulates the recipients of their service, or in a way that otherwise materially distorts or impairs the ability of the recipient to make free and informed decisions. There are caveats to that in terms of how broad it is, but it's obviously an attempt by them or a movement by the EU to sort of have overarching prohibitions on dark patterns, unlike the UK. And there's also proposed Digital Fairness Act, which we expect will deal with in more detail with dark patterns and prohibition of dark patterns. So why are regulators increasingly concerned? This is providing you with a bit more context on why we're seeing more interesting dark patterns generally. There's three key reasons. One, we obviously live in a more digital world, think online shopping, social media, and as part of that, it's easier than ever for consumers to spend money to share their data. So preventing manipulation via dark patterns is becoming more and more important. Two, the digital world allows data to be collected via more forms than traditionally. So think, for example, the use of cookies when you visit a website. And three, the online choice architecture can change in real time. This was a specific concern that was flagged by the CMA and includes things like targeted personalization and the use of algorithms to change search results in real time, and that leads to a greater risk of manipulation. Two specific harms that the CMA has identified in the context of dark patterns in an increasingly digital world are: one, the distortion of consumer behavior, and by that they mean consumers buying products that they wouldn't otherwise buy, and paying more for products than they might otherwise pay as a result of dark patterns. And the other is a distortion of competition. So it shifts the focus of online sellers from things like price and quality to things which aren't in the consumer's interest. So think, for example, a website making the user interface harder to navigate in order to encourage someone to give their data or to purchase a more expensive product. The idea being that they're not focusing on the things that are actually important to consumers. Just to give you some colour on the impact of dark patterns, the European Commission fitness check, which looked at the effectiveness of the EU digital consumer legislative framework, found that failures of digital legislation regarding online consumer protection in the EU is costing about 7.9 billion euros per annum, with those costs or the highest level of detriment amongst the younger generations, younger age groups. That cost isn't solely dark patterns, but they are a major element of that. So that just gives you some idea of the costs specifically in Europe. They also found in 2022 that 97% of the most popular websites and apps in the EU, or that EU consumers were using, deployed at least one dark pattern. So that gives you an idea of the scale of dark patterns and their use. So on the slide, we just set out here some of the effects or the negative consequences of dark patterns. This isn't a complete list. I'm not going to run through the ones on the slide. You can read them at your leisure, but this helps to demonstrate both, why regulators are more concerned about dark patterns, but also enables you to gain an understanding of when you might be using one. So if a technique is having these effects, it might allow you to figure out if you're actually using a dark pattern. So now section 2. So as you said, we're going to look at the legal framework for dark patterns and how you differentiate between the neutral online choice architecture and specifically unlawful dark patterns. As we mentioned earlier, there's no single piece of legislation which prevents the techniques or prohibits techniques which meet the definition of dark patterns. Instead, what regulators have to do is rely on various pieces of underlying legislation. So from your perspective, you have to consider the legal framework in the round. As we noted before, not all techniques are going to meet that definition. And for some practices, it'll be very clear that they are prohibited. For others, it's going to depend on the specific technique you're looking at using and the context. Broadly, there are 3 areas. One is consumer protection law. This was primarily governed under the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regs 2008. However, most of that has now moved under the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act 2024, which replaced the regulations and came into force in April. The second main area used to sort of try and stop or prohibit dark patterns is the CAP code. So this is the rule book for non-broadcast advertisements, sales promotions, and direct marketing comms. It's industry self-regulation, but it does work within the legal regime. Failure to comply with ASA, which is the Advertising Standards Authority, decisions under the CAP code can lead to a number of non-legal consequences, things like bad publicity, denial of media space, lack of accreditations, and a failure to comply with the CAP code can also lead to decisions being made by relevant legal bodies like regulators or courts that the underlying legislation has been breached. So as we said, the CAP code works within the wider legal regime, even though it itself isn't law. And then the final one is the GDPR. Now the UK GDPR following Brexit, and that deals with the dark patterns that specifically involve personal data. I will now hand over to Katrina to deal with the DMCCA and consumer aspects in more detail.
Thanks, Sam. So as Sam mentioned earlier, the DMCCA has replaced the old regime, which was under the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations 2008. And in truth, mostly it replicates the old regime, but it's worth noting that there are a couple of new things in the DMCCA that didn't exist previously, which are sometimes examples of dark patterns, or particularly related to dark patterns in one way or another. So the first one is the incoming subscriptions regime. Now, it hasn't, this is the one bit of the consumer part of DMCCA, which has not yet come into force. We understand that it is due to come into force in 2026, probably in either April or October. And it is a whole specific compliance regime designed to address some of the dark patterns that we see around subscriptions. Because when Sam was talking earlier about, the amount of monies consumers lose to dark patterns, one of the biggest areas is subscriptions that they either didn't intend to sign up to in the first place, or are failing to cancel because it's too difficult to cancel, or they've forgotten that they've got the subscription. So we have a new compliance regime coming in, which will attempt to address some of those by having express obligations. But don't let that make you think that it means that until that regime comes in, there are no rules around subscriptions, because we definitely have seen the existing more general principles-based approach to consumer protection be applied in the subscriptions context to address some of the dark patterns related issues, particularly difficulties in cancelling. So there is still rules there, but there will be yet more rules to come. The other thing that is new in the DMCCA is the rules about reviews. And some people, not everyone, would count reviews which have been incentivized or somehow have not been made clear that they are not completely organic consumer reviews as a form of dark pattern. And we have some new offences around that, which in effect have created a new compliance regime whereby everyone will need to, who host reviews on the website, which to be honest is most people, will need to have some kind of policy, public facing, a bit like a privacy policy, about how they deal with those. There's also a new offence around displaying prices online, and this is to address the dark pattern of so-called drip pricing. And drip pricing is basically where we add small amounts of money throughout the purchase journey, and it's not terribly transparent to the consumer that you are doing that. So we have a new offence, which is a sort of akin to a strict liability offence, and some new rules about how pricing has to be displayed. So if you operate a website which shows prices, you should be looking at those new rules, and particularly the new guidance that's come out on that. And then the final thing in terms of actually substantive legal changes is there have been some, objectively, at least in terms of text, small changes made to what we used to think of as the unfair commercial practices regime. They have been put forward by the government very much in the spirit of sort of modernisation, taking the opportunity post-Brexit, because of course we inherited this from the EU, to update the regime, and that is certainly true. What it also does is probably in some cases make certain forms of dark patterns easier to enforce. So a good example of this is we've always had an offence around pressure selling, which was historically an offence when you gave a consumer a very limited amount of time to make a decision. They've taken the word very out. So it is now a limited amount of time, which clearly widens the offence and makes it easier to enforce than it would previously. It also, I think, acknowledges more expressly that what is an appropriate amount of time to allow a consumer to make a decision for it not to be pressure selling is probably very linked to what the item is. So it is more appropriate to give consumers longer if you have a higher ticket, more significant purchase. I think the guidance talks about buying a house. Versus, your sort of more everyday, smaller, fast-moving consumer goods. So it kind of acknowledges that there is what is an amount of time, an appropriate amount of time, is a little more varied. And then, of course, the final thing that everyone's talking about is the new enforcement regime, which I'll come back to later. Oh, in fact, I'll come back to on the next slide. So the new enforcement regime, I think the first thing to remember about the new enforcement regime under DMCCA, this is for the consumer parts of it. It is an additional enforcement regime. It does not replace anything that previously existed. So there is still the regime under the Enterprise Act where so-called voluntary undertakings, we'll come back to that point later, can be agreed with the CMA. There is still the ability for the CMA to take businesses to criminal prosecution, and the other regulators, such as the Advertising Standards Authority, who can, of course, refer you for prosecution by trading standards, still exist in full, as do trading standards' own regime. So this is an extra bit of enforcement that is now possible as of April this year. And what it does is it essentially aligns the CMA's powers that it had for competition and consumer. So the CMA is now empowered to make a decision that there has been a breach of consumer law and impose a civil fine of up to 10% of global turnover for breach, which is not to say, of course, that there will be every infraction will be a 10% global group turnover fine, but it does mean that the potential exists there. And it is deliberately been introduced to drive compliance up the agenda in businesses and make this a board level risk. It is not in principle going to replace the use of undertakings, but what we are hearing from the CMA is what they didn't like about undertakings was the ability of businesses to negotiate those. And what they prefer about the new regime is that they get to essentially mandate, and then they have to consider any comments the business might want to make, and then they make a decision rather than having this more free-flowing negotiation. So we are expecting to see more of the CMA imposing things rather than agreeing to undertakings. They, of course, will presumably still prosecute the most egregious examples through the courts. And we are starting to get a steer from the CMA as to how they might use these powers. We understand that they are particularly interested in this time of a cost of living crisis on what are called non-discretionary purchases. So that's things that we all have to buy. So things like food, rent, and such like. Less interested in things like holidays. They have already commenced enforcement because they gave an enforcement grace period in terms of the new obligations for reviews. That is over. The first letters have gone out. So we know that that is coming. And they have also said that they want to have this program of putting out this new simplified guidance. So I think we can reasonably expect that when they put out a piece of simplified guidance, they will then expect to enforce after it. And then the final thing is terms. And particularly, I would suggest subscription terms or any kind of auto renewal seem to be high on the agenda. But kind of taking us back to dark patterns particularly, the DMCC, like the old regime, has this idea of what we used to call blacklisted or possibly always unfair offences. So things that are deliberately designed to be specific offences that are easy to prosecute. And the ones that come up the most in the context of dark patterns is this idea of pressure selling. So that's putting consumers under unreasonable pressure to make a decision. So that could be by, countdown timers, only giving them short periods of time, saying that there is a limit, that it might go quickly, so kind of urgency type messaging. There are also various offences around false availability of products, so telling people that things exist that they don't, which could lead into a kind of bait and switch where you say, well, that doesn't exist, but what about this? And then the final one that I touched on earlier is we've got this new offence around, in fact, a couple of new offences around fake reviews. But underpinning that, and this is probably the hardest bit to apply, are the more general principles. So you've got the general prohibition on something which is an unfair commercial practice, which is something which has to be contrary to the requirements of professional diligence. Now, this is really hard to apply in an online context because the guidance on professional diligence doesn't really talk about online. So it does mean that there is a lot of uncertainty, if you like, as to what is reasonable on professional diligence. Now, the CMA has said that it will issue new guidance on this point, but we haven't seen anything very much yet on that point. So for the meantime, I think it's almost starting to think through, well, does it kind of does it feel a little uncomfortable? Does it feel like we've not got the right balance of power here? Does this feel like something that somebody could argue is contrary to professional diligence? And then starting to look at some of the examples of how the CMA has applied that and other international regulators. Notwithstanding the uncertainty here, and it is a real legal risk. In actual fact, most of the dark pattern enforcements we're seeing for the CMA and their equivalents in Europe focus more on misleadingness, particularly misleading omissions or actions. So they are focusing more on things like promotional countdown timers that restart. That is misleading because actually the countdown timer makes you think you only have so much time, but actually when you get to the end of it, it starts again. So at the moment, it's more in that space that the actual enforcement is happening. And I think it's because it's easier to be precise about what's going on. It's also worth bearing in mind, although again, we haven't seen much enforcement here, that aggressive practices could potentially be used, particularly if you happen to have a product or service that would be targeting a vulnerable consumer. So, for example, someone who lacks capacity, maybe has a disability, maybe is old, very old or young, or in some way is in a vulnerable situation. Because one of the new things that the DMCCA does is it allows that consumer vulnerability is a factor in deciding what is aggressive. And I think there is a world in which dark patterns like nagging, where you like do repeated pop-ups and you keep asking the same question until you get the answer that you want again and again and again, might in some consequences be an aggressive practice. And particularly if you're dealing with a vulnerable consumer base and your product is targeting them. And then,
sorry. Sorry, so we're just moving on to the CAP code. We'll be a bit shorter on the CAP code and the GDPR, just because it's not as new as the DMCCA. So CAP code doesn't contain specific references to dark patterns, but it does contain provisions which allow the ASA to prohibit or mitigate the impacts of many types of dark patterns. So just giving you two examples that Katrina's already touched on in the context of the DMCCA. It can be used to mitigate drip pricing. So again, as a reminder, that's where additional charges are sort of revealed at a later stage in the consumer journey. The way that the CAP code does that is by requiring that quoted prices include things like non-optional taxes, duties, etc., that apply to all or most buyers. Therefore, if those sorts of charges are being introduced sort of later on or disclosed later on in the consumer process, then it's likely that that would be in breach of the CAP code. So that's how the CAP code can help to mitigate or to prevent drip pricing. The other one, Trin touched on before, is subscription traps. Obviously, the DMCCA is going to introduce much stronger provisions to prevent subscription traps when those elements of the DMCCA come into force. But the way that the CAP code can be used to mitigate subscription trap risks is that it requires ads to include certain information, such as, for example, whether or not a free trial automatically converts to a paid subscription on termination. So again, this doesn't prevent subscription traps, but it does help to mitigate the risk that consumers will be caught by a subscription trap. And obviously, once the DMCCA provisions come into force, subscription traps will hopefully be much harder for organisations to introduce. These are just two examples of how the ASA can use the CAP code, but there are many others. And then final one is the GDPR. Again, as with the CAP code, GDPR doesn't specifically refer to dark patterns. What we've set out on the screen are some of the main provisions of the GDPR that might be used to prevent dark patterns, as well as accountability, which is a kind of consistent principle that you should always keep in mind when looking to comply with the GDPR. Obviously, it should be noted that the GDPR the GDPR's ability to prevent dark patterns is limited to where a dark pattern involves the use of personal data. So it's slightly narrower in scope than the CAP code and the DMCCA. But obviously, given the importance of data in our ever increasingly digital world, the GDPR is still very useful and a very useful tool for regulators in preventing dark patterns. Just to give you a summary of what's on the screen. So the first 5 are principles. under Article 5 of the GDPR, of which fairness and transparency are probably the two most likely to apply to dark patterns, and that's because dark patterns often involve some form of deception or coercion, and therefore are likely to breach the fairness principle or transparency principles. The sixth one on the screen is consent validity. So just as a reminder, consent under GDPR requires that it be fully informed, freely given, and that it be as easy to withdraw as it is to provide the consent. So as a result, if dark patterns are trying to get people to consent to something in a deceptive or manipulative way, there's a pretty high chance that they're going to be in breach of the consent requirements under GDPR. And then the final one on the slide is data protection by design and default. So as a reminder, that in effect requires that you embed data privacy features and enhancing technologies directly into the design of projects at an early stage. So it might be that some dark patterns fulfill of this requirement, for example, where they lead to a non-privacy enhancing user interface design. So for example, default settings that are set to be sort of to share data by default in the most widely available way, particularly thinking there of social media companies. So that's a very quick run through the GDPR and the CAP code, and obviously Katrina gave us a more detailed view of the DMCCA and the consumer protections. We now just wanted to cover off some examples of dark patterns to give you some more colour on when you might see them in practice. What we've done is take some of the examples from an ICO and CMA joint paper. The reason we've taken some examples from that is that it's quite useful to give you examples of where two of the main regulators have identified concerns with certain techniques. Obviously, because of that, please note that the techniques, until otherwise say, are assume that personal data is being used. Obviously, dark patterns don't always need to involve personal data, but the ICO is involved in developing these examples. So obviously that requires personal data to be involved. The one on the screen, or the first one on the screen, is an example of a nudge and sludge. Nudges and sludges basically are where a website or a site makes it easier to select the option the site wants you to select, or it makes it easy to agree to something and then harder to withdraw that agreement. The ICO's concern with techniques like that are that it, as we said before, breaches transparency and fairness, the two most likely to apply principles, and that also those sorts of techniques might be a breach of the consent requirements where you're asking for consent, for example, to process personal data, that being on the basis that it's got to be informed, and you might be making it harder to withdraw the consent than you were to provide it. CMA's concerns with nudges and sludges were primarily around competition, because they were concerned that larger websites might be able to harvest more data using these sorts of techniques. The example on this screen, just sort of walk you through it, is a case where the step that allows the website to use data, your personal data, only requires one action, while signing up in an instance where you don't want the site to use your data involves 4 steps, rather than, for example, a sort of reject all or don't use option. So what the site is doing is it's making it harder for you to go down the don't use my data route than it is to go down the yes, you can use my data route. The impact of this sort of technique is obviously that consumers in effect find it harder to do what they might want to do, and that it kind of encourages an overall shift in behavior towards something that consumers wouldn't otherwise choose to do. The second example that we wanted to show you is an example of biased framing. So biased framing is basically where a site frames one decision, the one that they want you to take, in a positive light, while it frames the decision they don't want you to take in a more negative light. As with the above example, or the previous example, the ICO has concerns over fairness and transparency, and again, a failure or any consent that's provided in that context not being fully informed. The CMA's concerns were that the techniques might stem into being misleading and therefore be a breach of consumer law. The example on the screen is one where a site is emphasizing the positive elements. So, for example, getting a tailored service, while downplaying the potential downsides, such as increased tracking, increased data collection. The impact of these sorts of techniques are that it changes the consumer's perception of the pros and cons of a decision, leading to them making a decision that they wouldn't otherwise make that might not be in their best interests. And then on this slide, we've got 3 further examples. I won't go into them in the same level of detail, but broadly, confirm shaming is basically where a website puts pressure on someone to take the option that they want them to take. So it's kind of similar to bias framing, but it's much more about sort of shaming the customer. So, for example, asking someone to consent to receive marketing, you might have a sort of reject button or a I do not consent button that actually says, nah, I hate savings. It's sort of pushing people to feel bad about not giving you consent to send them marketing. Bundle consent, basically where you bundle consent for various purposes into one consent option. Obviously, that is a sort of breach of the consent requirements under the ICO guidance. You've got to give people the option to consent to different purposes, use of the data for different purposes. And the final one is default settings. We covered that earlier in the sort of summary of the GDPR provisions, but basically that could be the way in which you use default settings could be a breach of fairness and transparency or privacy by default. So that's, for example, like we said, the default settings for social media being to share as much data as possible or pre-tick boxes for consent. And obviously that would be invalid consent under the GDPR. So those are some other examples that the ICO and the CMA gave. And then we just wanted to give you a sort of final real life example of a roach motel, otherwise known as subscription traps. These are potentially aggressive or unfair commercial practices. They will also be there'll be much stronger provisions around roach motel subscription traps, as we mentioned, being introduced under the DMCCA. What this shows on screen is the process for a well-known company and ending membership. Something that I came across in my personal life. As you can see, there are 5 steps that this company presents you with before you can cancel. So when you start cancellation process, they link you to offers. They ask you if there's anything they can do for you. They show you the benefits of your membership. They tell you what you're missing out of, and finally they present you with a discount. So basically making it very hard for you to leave. And that is a real life example of a roach motel or a subscription trap. So now we're just going to move to enforcement action, and I will hand over back to Katrina.
Thanks, Sam. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to take a little bit of a whistle-stop tour through enforcement. So we've got a few minutes at the end for Q&A. So first of all, kicking off, and this was very topical because it's all about Oasis tickets, so it hit the press quite a lot. The CMA has an ongoing investigation into Ticketmaster. It was initially an investigation into something called dynamic pricing, which is where pricing actually changes. So the same item is sold at different prices. We're all sort of familiar with it in the context of maybe seats on aeroplanes will tend to change depending on various factors. So we know that those prices go up and down. Interestingly, quite early on in the investigation, we had an announcement from the CMA to say that actually there wasn't, as a matter of fact, dynamic pricing. It wasn't that the pricing has actually changed, it was that the pricing was tiered, and that their concern was that consumers had been misled because they had not actually been informed about these tiering up front, and then as they waited a very long time and then had quite a short window to make a decision. So this is quite a good illustration of how the enforcement actually often comes ultimately under the prohibitions on misleading, and quite often the remedy, at least at the moment, that we're seeing regulators like the CMA looking for is more transparency earlier on in the consumer journey about what it is that they might be buying. In this case, the fact that different seats might be sold at different prices, and even though you might have paid a higher price for a premium seat, you might actually be in exactly the same place as a non-premium seat when you actually see the concert. We then had another piece of enforcement. This was basically around promotional strategy and particularly focusing on what's called urgency claims and countdown timers. So countdown timers are where you have a promotional price and it counts down. An urgency claim is something like saying limited stock, or is suggesting to consumers that they have to make a decision urgently, otherwise they might miss out. And the CMA did an online choice architecture investigation, and they looked at 2 mattresses companies, Emma Sleep and Simba. Now, This was an investigation that was launched prior to their new powers under DMCCA, which is important, but it does illustrate the use of different powers. So what has actually happened is that in both cases, the CMA has clearly concluded that their use of countdown times in particular misleading because they restarted, and that they are concerned about the urgency claims. SIMBA has accepted voluntary undertakings and will be monitored. And those undertakings are in the public domain, and they are all about things like how there will be gaps between promotions and that timers won't restart, etc., etc. Emma has obviously either not been offered voluntary undertakings or I suspect more likely declined to take them. And earlier this month, the CMA applied to the High Court for an enforcement order to force Emma to actually comply, breach of which would be a criminal offence. So Emma is currently being taken down the criminal prosecution route. Whether they will ultimately get to that point, we don't know. But clearly it is a sort of illustration of the different powers the CMA has. Obviously, any investigation that was started now, they would additionally have those civil fining powers of up to 10% of group global turnover. So maybe if it were, if you like, started now, maybe they would have gone down that route with Emma rather than the criminal prosecution. Hard to know. We've then got some examples of ASA enforcement. So this is enforcement of the CAP code, which of course mirrors broadly what we get under DMCCA, but in the context of things which are legally considered to be advertising only, but bearing in mind that pretty much all websites are considered to be advertising. It's not as limiting as you might think. And this was all about an advert for trainers on Alibaba, which did not make it clear that actually the trainers or the image of the trainers was misleading because it was not the trainers that were actually sold when you clicked through. So in that sense, it was a dark pattern in that it was trying to get you to click through and choose something else. And then finally, Amazon has suffered a great deal of enforcement in relation to dark patterns internationally. Here in the UK, we had an ASA decision on the classic topic of Amazon dark patterns enforcement, which is, of course, Prime. And this was about how easy it was, or not in this case, to actually buy the item that the consumer might want to buy without also, as part of that consumer journey, signing up to Prime. And it was found that the way the information was displayed made it very, very hard, and that was a breach of the CAP code. So in terms of trends going forward, we do know that the CMA is continuing to look at online choice architecture. They were very clear when they got their powers in April that they envisaged continuing to look at online choice architecture. They tend to look at things thematically. So they have historically, for example, looked at things like countdown timers and promotional things. They've also looked at other areas, enforcement voucher and such like before that. So we expect that there'll be future themes. They're definitely looking at reviews. They may also look at other areas as well. The ASA is probably the most active in terms of like day to day. And I would say that we sort of routinely see a couple of enforcement actions in relation to online choice architecture. I don't know, maybe one every 3 months or so. So, they are coming, not maybe quite as much as the greenwashing ones, but it's an active area and something they're concerned about. And then the ICO is also clearly interested. It's working with the CMA on some of these issues because this is a crossover area. But they're probably the least active in terms of overtly looking at this area and focusing on online choice architecture. But some of their enforcement could be characterized as addressing dark patterns, for example, cookie banners. And then I think the final point just to say is that this is an area that is definitely getting focused politically. And the effect of that is that regulators are being encouraged to enforce more because there is a perception, at least, of under enforcement here and of very large, widespread consumer harm that is damaging to consumers. But also at least in some quarters, there is pressure to have more explicit bans on certain types of dark patterns. And this has come up with DMCCA, and I think it will come up again in terms of future regulation.
Brilliant. Thanks both. That's great. So I'm conscious of time. We'll try and wrap up by 10:45. We've had a few questions through. We probably haven't got time for more than one or two, but I thought the first one I'd ask was somebody's asked whether nagging, if nagging, i.e. repeated pop-ups, is an aggressive practice. Would that also include email reminders saying things like, you looked at product, would you like to come back and buy it? And I suppose there is probably a number of areas that cuts across, but yeah, would either of you like to comment on that one?
Well, from my perspective, and Sam, do chip in on this. My understanding is that there is a specific regime under data protection which allows you to contact people proactively, a sort of quasi form of consent or soft opt-in, who have abandoned baskets. And so I think those emails normally fall under that regime. Now, that is not to say that you couldn't conclude that it is also a dark pattern and potentially aggressive or in some way problematic under consumer protection legislation. And that is a big message that comes through in the joint work that the ICO and the CMA have been doing, that actually sometimes you might still find problems in other bits of legislation. But the fact that there is a specific regime that allows it, I think does give a certain amount of protection against that, because it's more difficult to come to that conclusion.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And then I'm conscious that there are a couple of final tidy up things, so we might need to leave it there. One other question, because it follows a theme of a couple of the other questions we got, is as marketers, how can we avoid the legal pitfalls while still encouraging people to take action we want? I think probably the short answer is phone somebody like Katrina and Sam to have a conversation about it, or talk to your internal legal team. But but we're probably out of time to say much more than that, I'm afraid. So yes,
just
Sam,
what I would say, Peter,
sorry,
if there's anyone here, I know we've got a couple of anonymous questions. If you would like us to kind of look at them and potentially come back to you, do put your names in, because we obviously can't respond to anonymous questions.
There's one more reminder, which is just the next one of these coming up in November, which will be on CMA again, dawn raids this time. So Nicola is going to be covering essential things to know about unannounced CMA inspections. I think that's it for today. Thanks for the questions, those who raised them. Sorry we couldn't cover them all, and hopefully see you again soon.